By the spring of 1915, the war had already devoured Europe's youth. The optimism of that first summer had rotted in the mud of Flanders and the dust of Champagne. Every nation was exhausted, yet none could stop. They were trapped by pride, by alliances, by the illusion that one last push would bring victory. And in the middle of this madness, a few men dared to think differently. In the city of Lincoln, England, inside the workshops of William Foster and Company, the sound of hammers echoed day and night. Steam hissed from engines, sparks fell like fireflies. Among the factory workers, rumors spread. They were building something unusual, something secret. Some said it was a mobile water tank for the desert. Others whispered it was an armored car for the Navy. The truth was stranger than either. The man overseeing the work was William Ashby Tritton, a 38-year-old engineer with the temperament of a blacksmith and the imagination of a poet. He had been building agricultural machinery for years, but now he was building something that might end the bloodletting in France. With him was Lieutenant Walter Gordon Wilson, a naval officer turned inventor. Wilson was quiet, methodical, brilliant. He understood machinery in the same way a musician understands notes. Together, these two men would shape the first creature of modern war. Their task was almost impossible. They were told to build a machine that could move over trenches, crush barbed wire, carry guns, and withstand machine gun fire. It had to be fast enough to keep up with infantry, light enough to cross bridges, and cheap enough to build in numbers. And it had to work on ground so churned and cratered that horses broke their legs just trying to walk. No one had ever built anything like it. No one even knew if it could be done. But Tritton and Wilson shared something that most of their military overseers lacked: curiosity. They believed that if you could imagine it, you could build it. Failure was only a step between blueprints. Their first attempt, Little Willie, was a strange-looking creature, a squat, box-shaped machine sitting on two sets of continuous tracks. Inside, a six-cylinder engine roared like a trapped beast. It had armor, it had guns, it could move, but only just. It weighed too much for its engine, and when it tried to cross a trench, the front simply fell in. The idea was right, but the shape was wrong. They learned by breaking things. When Little Willie failed, they tore it apart and started again. They stretched the hull until it looked absurdly long. They added track plates that wrapped around the entire body like a metal belt. They mounted cannons on the sides, not the front, to avoid sinking into craters. And with each experiment, they were inching closer to a miracle. The next prototype, Mother, was born in early 1916. She was longer, heavier, and stronger. When she rolled over a ditch at the test field, the earth itself seemed to bow before her. She could climb walls taller than a man. For the first time, an engine could do what flesh could not. Those who witnessed her trials would never forget the sight. A 30-ton monster crawling over mud and timber, groaning like a ship at sea, leaving crushed earth in her wake. Smoke billowed from her exhaust like breath from some iron dragon. It was magnificent and terrifying all at once. But outside those secret fields, few people even knew such a thing existed. Secrecy was vital. If Germany learned that Britain was building armored landships, they might develop their own, or worse, destroy them before they could reach the front. The entire project operated under a veil of deception. When government officials discussed the machines, they called them tanks, short for water tanks, to hide their purpose. The name was meant to be temporary, a piece of misdirection. Yet it stuck. The name became the symbol of a revolution. In London, Ernest Swinton fought a quieter war. He wrote reports, gave lectures, and argued endlessly with generals who did not understand him. He was not an engineer, but he understood the battlefield. He knew that machines could only change the war if generals were willing to change their minds, and that, he found, was the hardest battle of all. Swinton wrote, "The tank was not born in the workshop, but in the trenches." He meant that desperation, not inspiration, was its real father. Every day, telegrams arrived at the War Office listing tens of thousands of casualties. Each offensive failed for the same reason. Men could not move faster than bullets. The tank was not a weapon of aggression. It was a shield that moved. While engineers built prototypes, politicians schemed and argued. The Landships Committee was disbanded in late 1915, its members reassigned or dismissed. But the seed they had planted took root in the War Office. The Army, once openly hostile, began to take notice. They had run out of alternatives. By early 1916, the first production order was placed, 100 machines based on Mother's design. Factories in Birmingham, Newcastle, and Lincoln began building the components. Steel, engines, gears, and tracks poured into secret depots. The 1st Tank Battalion was formed, the Heavy Section Machine Gun Corps. Its men were volunteers, mostly mechanics and drivers. They trained in the English countryside, far from prying eyes under code names and false orders. Even they did not fully understand what they were preparing for. Their training ground was Elveden, in Suffolk, where the fields were carved into mock trenches. The recruits learned to start, steer, and repair the monstrous machines. Engines overheated, tracks jammed. Exhaust filled the cabins until the men coughed black smoke. They learned that driving a tank was not like driving anything else. It was part engineering, part endurance, part faith. Inside, it was hell. The idiot noise was deafening, the heat unbearable. When shells struck the armor, splinters of hot metal ricocheted inside like shrapnel, cutting through clothing and flesh. To protect themselves, the crews wore chainmail masks, leather jackets, and goggles. Medieval armor reborn for a modern nightmare. They were called tank men, but they felt like prisoners inside their own machines. Still, they believed in the idea. They called their vehicles by names that sounded half affectionate, half fearful: Creeper, Crusher, Crusader. Each tank was a new experiment, a promise, and a gamble. And soon, that gamble would be tested in battle. Back in the War Office, Winston Churchill's career had already taken a hit after the disastrous Gallipoli campaign. He had been dismissed from the Admiralty and forced into political exile, but his fingerprints were still on the tank project. Though he no longer had the power to command it, the machines he had once protected were moving toward their destiny, and he would live to see his mad idea vindicated. Meanwhile, in Germany, the High Command still believed that the war could be won by artillery and courage alone. They dismissed reports of British armored engines as propaganda. They trusted their trenches, their machine guns, and their gas. But the quiet birth of the tank was something new under the sun, an invention that belonged to no single nation, but to necessity itself. As production continued, the first tank crews were assembled into units. Each crew consisted of 8 men: driver, commander, gunners, mechanics. They learned to live inside the machine for hours at a time, sweating, deafened, and half blind. They developed a strange camaraderie, something between madness and pride. When they spoke of the war to come, they called themselves land sailors, steering iron ships across an ocean of mud. Every detail had to be invented from nothing. How to load ammunition inside, how to signal, how to coordinate with infantry. There were no manuals, only trial and error. And for every tank that ran, another broke down. But each failure was a step forward. In June 1916, the machines were loaded onto ships under armed guard. They were covered in tarps, labeled water containers for Russia. Even the dock workers who loaded them had no idea what they were. The crews followed soon after, disguised as an engineering unit. Their orders were to await deployment on the Somme. On the morning of September 15th, 1916, they would go into battle for the first time. But for now, as they crossed the Channel, they were still part of a secret too strange to believe. They were soldiers carrying the future, hidden beneath canvas. For Tritton and Wilson, watching from England, the feeling was bittersweet. They had built something that had no name when it began, and no guarantee it would work. They had fought bureaucracy, ridicule, and exhaustion. Now their creation was leaving their hands forever. Whatever happened next, history would decide if they were geniuses or fools. In the trenches of the Western Front, the soldiers waiting for the Somme offensive knew nothing about the new machines. They only knew that they were about to attack again, that the generals promised this time would be different, that the shelling had gone on for days, and that the ground itself had been pulverized into dust. They had heard those promises before. What they could not imagine was that far behind them, engines were already warming, engines that would change everything. In the summer twilight, as the sun set over the ruined fields of France, a few officers looked out at the endless horizon and wondered how to break the deadlock. They did not know that salvation was already on the move, clanking, roaring, crawling, coming for the wire. In the darkness of the British docks, a sentry walked his post, unaware that behind the steel plates under his boots lay a revolution in waiting. The first tanks stood silent, like sleeping giants. Their crews slept beside them, dreaming of what they would soon unleash. They didn't know what awaited them, only that they were part of something new, something no soldier in history had ever seen. And somewhere, deep in the mind of a dismissed politician, and a handful of stubborn engineers, the impossible had already become inevitable. They had given war a new shape, and in doing so, they had changed the destiny of every battle to come. They did not know it yet, but their machines would crawl into legend. Dawn, September 15th, 1916. The world had never seen anything like what was about to happen. For weeks, the guns had thundered across the Somme Valley. The British Army had fired more than 1 million shells. Every hill, every tree, every blade of grass had been torn apart. The ground itself was a graveyard, cratered, waterlogged, pulsing with the stench of cordite and decay. At 0 hour, tens of thousands of men would go over the top again, just as they had in July, when 60,000 fell in a single day. But this morning, the infantry were not alone. Hidden behind the front lines under heavy tarps and guarded by armed sentries stood 49 new machines. They looked nothing like anything on Earth, great metal beasts with riveted sides and treads that wrapped around their bodies like armor. Inside, the crew sweated in their leather and chainmail masks, listening to the cough and sputter of engines that might betray them before they ever reached the enemy. Each machine had a name: Creme de Menthe, Creeping Jenny, Big Willie, the Devil's Own. They were about to crawl into hell. At first light, the fog hung thick over the battlefield. Mud clung to boots, to wheels, to everything. The tanks moved forward in low gear, engines growling like monsters awakening from a century-long sleep. Infantrymen turned to stare. Some laughed, thinking they were tractors. Others made the sign of the cross. When the machines reached the front trenches, they paused. A few soldiers reached out to touch the cold steel, as if needing to know it was real. Then, one by one, they lurched forward into no man's land. The Germans had no idea what was coming. Through the mist, they saw shapes moving, too large for men, too slow for cavalry. They opened fire, and the bullets sparked harmlessly off the armor. The machines did not stop. They rolled straight through the barbed wire, crushing it flat, then over the first trench and the second. Machine guns that had mowed down battalions now fell silent. Gunners panicked. Some fled. Others froze as the beasts closed in. Inside each tank, the world was chaos. Engines roared louder than artillery. Heat baked the crews alive. Oil dripped from gears, smoke filled the air, and every bolt vibrated like it would explode. Communication was impossible. The men shouted, waved, or kicked each other to signal turns. When a shell hit the armor, the steel shivered, and red-hot fragments sprayed inside, but the tanks kept going. One of the first to reach the German line was HMLS Cordon Rouge. Her commander, Lieutenant Arnold, later wrote, "The enemy ran before us like rats. We could see them abandoning their guns, throwing down rifles. I thought, this is it. This is how we break the trench." For a few hours that morning, it seemed he might be right. The psychological impact was beyond calculation. German officers reported seeing their men frozen in disbelief. One prisoner told his Hohen captors he thought the British had created moving fortresses by witchcraft. The tank was not just a machine, it was terror made visible, but miracles have limits. Of the 49 tanks that set out that morning, barely 20 reached the starting line. Engines seized, gears jammed, some sank into shell holes and never moved again. Others broke their tracks on the shattered ground. Those that did reach the front moved so slowly that infantry often advanced faster on foot. Still, wherever a tank appeared, the line shifted. Wire flattened, machine guns fell silent, trenches were captured that had resisted for months. For the first time in the war, the German line cracked, not because of numbers or shells, but because of something new. By afternoon, most of the machines had stopped. Engines overheated. Fuel ran out. Crews stumbled out coughing, half blind, black with soot. Some lay beside their tanks, too weak to move. And yet, as they watched, the infantry, men who had survived 2 years of slaughter, began to cheer. They had seen the future, and it was made of steel. News of the land cruisers spread quickly. At first, newspapers had no idea what to call them. Some said ironclads, others mobile forts. The name tank slipped from a code word into common use. It was shorter, easier to print, and somehow perfect. The British government embraced it, printing pamphlets and posters about the new wonder weapon. Even as most tanks sat broken in mud, their image became a symbol of hope. Behind the lines, the engineers studied what had gone wrong. The tracks needed to be stronger. The engines needed more power. The steering was a nightmare, 2 men pulling massive levers just to turn a few degrees. But the concept had been proven. A tank could cross trenches, crush wire, and live under fire. The age of the machine had begun. Among the German ranks, disbelief turned to panic, then to study. They recovered damaged tanks and examined them in detail. They found flaws, thin armor, weak joints, exposed engines, but they also saw potential. German commanders ordered countermeasures, armor piercing bullets, new trenches, special mines, and above all, artillery. The one thing that could still stop a tank cold. The arms race had started. For the British, the success at Flers-Courcelette was both triumph and illusion. They had gained 5 miles of ground at terrible cost. Tanks had shocked the enemy but could not hold the field. Still, the headlines called it victory, and in war, perception can be more powerful than reality. In the months that followed, the British built hundreds more tanks. Each model improved on the last. Stronger armor, better cooling, more firepower. They created new types, the male tanks with cannons and the female versions armed with machine guns for infantry support. They began to imagine tactics, formations of tanks moving together, covering each other, advancing like a fleet across the battlefield. The men who drove them became something new. Not infantry, not cavalry, but something between soldier and engineer. They called themselves landship crews. They lived like sailors and fought like miners, working by touch and instinct inside a world of noise and fumes. They became the first generation of armored warriors. The public adored them. Photographs of tanks in parades filled newspapers. Children built models from scrap metal. Cartoonists drew tanks crushing the Kaiser beneath their tracks. The machines became myth before they were even fully functional. For a war drowning in despair, they were proof that human invention could still surprise the darkness, but behind the myth was exhaustion. Each tank took months to build, and most broke down within hours in combat. Crews trained endlessly but never knew if their machine would start when it mattered. And for all their terror, the tanks killed fewer Germans than artillery did in an hour. The tank's real power was not destruction. It was imagination. It gave men a reason to believe the war could still be won by something other than slaughter. By early 1917, the tank was no longer a secret. Germany had faced it, feared it, and begun to prepare for its return. The British command debated how to use it next. Some argued for small support roles. Others, like Swinton, dreamed of massed armored offensives that could break the entire front. But the army was conservative. They still saw tanks as novelty, not necessity. Their fear of failure outweighed their hunger for victory. In France, a young officer named Jean-Baptiste Estienne watched the British experiments closely. He was convinced that the future of warfare belonged to these machines. France began developing its own version, smaller, faster, designed for mobility rather than brute strength. In the Renault factories outside Paris, a new generation of tanks began to take shape, machines that would soon eclipse their British ancestors. Meanwhile, in Germany, the lessons of the Somme were being studied by a different kind of mind, analytical, ruthless, precise. Among them were young officers who would one day reshape the entire philosophy of war. Heinz Guderian, Erwin Rommel, and their generation, still unknown, still learning in the mud. They saw in the tank not just a weapon, but a principle, speed, surprise, shock. But that revelation was still years away. For now, the world was still trapped in the trenches. The tank was a glimpse of what might come, but not yet the key to victory. After its debut, the machines rested, repaired, and multiplied. The next time they appeared, they would not come as a handful of experiments. They would come as an army of iron. In London, Swinton wrote in his diary, "The tank is not a weapon of war. It is a weapon of hope." He had watched his idea crawl from ridicule to reality, but he also saw how fragile it was. If the next assault failed, the generals would abandon it entirely. He knew that one battle could decide the future of mechanized warfare. And so, as 1917 dawned, Britain prepared for a new offensive, one designed around the tanks themselves. The place was Cambrai, a quiet town in northern France. The plan was simple and bold. No preliminary bombardment, no warning to the enemy, just hundreds of tanks advancing together at dawn. If it worked, it could change everything. If it failed, the dream would die. The Somme had been the birth cry. Cambrai would be the test. The tank had survived its infancy. Now, it would have to grow up. But before that next chapter of war began, the men who had driven the first tanks gathered in their camps. They cleaned their machines, patched the armor, oiled the gears. Some painted names and insignia on the steel sides: dragons, skulls, hearts, flags. Each one was different, each one personal. They were not just machines, they were companions, even extensions of their souls. One crewman wrote home: "She moves slow and she burns my lungs, but she's alive. I think she knows when we're in trouble." In the silence of the camp, the tanks stood in rows, hulking silhouettes against the evening sky, smoke drifting from their exhausts. The men who built them called them inventions. The men who drove them called them beasts. But history would call them something else entirely: the beginning of the end for the age of men on foot. In less than a year, they would roll again, stronger, faster, deadlier, and when they did, the world would never go back.